Have you ever played a board game and had the dice roll off the table or knock all the pieces over? Well, in this video, I'm going to build something to stop that. A dice tray. And if board games aren't your thing, we'll just call this a regular tray. What makes this build unique, for me at least, is an approach I'm trying for the first time, gluing together these triangular pieces to create a flat board for the tray's base. Like most of my projects at the moment, I'm starting with offcuts. For this one, I'm using some thin black cherry scraps that have been sitting around since I made a table years ago. I'm starting with the base, and I'm cutting a bunch of small rectangular pieces which I'll plane smooth, and then cut those into the triangles. I've had a couple of comments in my previous videos about my workbench being wobbly, and you're absolutely right, it is. You can see it in this shot here. This is the first hand tool workbench I ever built, and while I'm proud of what I made, there are a lot of issues with it, and fairly soon I plan to build a newer, more robust version, so stay tuned for that. And for anyone wondering how the bird table from my last video is doing, well, the birds are really enjoying it, which is nice to see.
Okay, so I've got all of my triangular pieces cut with a few spare in case I need to fill any gaps, and it's all a little bit rough at the moment, so I'm going to spend a fair amount of time just planing things straight, square, smooth, so that I can eventually get them hopefully glued up into a solid shape. Then I can sand it all and eventually cut it down to a square. Don't know if this is going to work, but if it does, it'll be pretty cool.
I gave all the triangles a bit more finessing so that they'd hopefully glue together without any gaps, which, as you'll see shortly, didn't really work very well. Most of the triangles in the circle were just cut at random from the bits of wood I had, but this last one I had to cut specifically to fill the gap that was left at the end, which was quite handy as it meant I could make it fit nice and tight.
So I've got all of these pieces smoothed and roughly the same thickness. There's a little bit of variance, but I'll be able to sand that out once they've all been glued together. So first things first, play with the layout and then glue up.
When it came to gluing all of the triangles together, I decided to try and mitigate any issues or mistakes and use a perfectly flat piece of plywood as a base to keep things nice and flat, and then put some baking paper on top to stop the triangles from just sticking to it. I started squeezing out a bunch of exterior wood glue and then realised I had some much nicer Gorilla wood glue, so I used that instead. As I was gluing, I rubbed each piece back and forth, which has a sort of vacuum effect and holds the pieces together better. Everything was going pretty well so far, but things were about to take a turn, and the first problem was with the camera, which ran out of battery midway through gluing up. But that was a minor issue, as I was almost finished gluing up anyway, and I can charge the battery overnight while the glue dries. The next morning I could finesse the final piece and get it glued into place, and after a little more time passed, I could peel the paper off and cut the whole thing down to a more manageable size. I started sanding to try and get everything flat, and this is where the second problem occurred. You see, I got impatient and switched to using the hand plane to flatten things, and, well, I broke it.
Basically, I thought I'd be able to do it a lot faster if I used the plane instead of sandpaper, and
Whilst that might have been true if I'd done it properly, I was using this bench hook, which at this point I've more or less destroyed with the circular saw. The end just wasn't holding it was slipping off, breaking. But on the plus side, it gave me the opportunity to address some gaps that were in it the first time that I glued it up. So I cleaned up those edges. I actually broke it in another place so that I could fix some more gaps, and now it's much stronger. So the plan now is to secure it a lot better than I did before, and then use this new number 80 scraper, and it should do a much better job than this one. What could go wrong?
This time around, I secured it in place by using a trick I've seen tons of other people use online, which is to take a couple of bits of masking tape, stick one to the workpiece and the other to your workbench, and then superglue the two bits of tape together. And by using the tape, you'll be able to peel it off afterwards without damaging anything. Now, this is the first time I've used one of these scrapers, and it took me a few attempts to get it set up correctly, but once it is, it's surprising just how useful it can be. You might notice at this point that I've switched back to the plane here, and maybe you're thinking, hang on a minute, isn't that how you broke it before? And yes is the answer to that, but it's secured much better now, and I gave the plane a fresh sharpen before doing this step. And it worked pretty well to remove a slightly larger amount of material than the scraper did. And then once things were much flatter, I moved back to the scraper to finish off.
Okay, that's got the surface finish way better. I can't believe I didn't get one of these sooner. It's so useful, so good when it's set up right. Even if I did do most of the work with this, I think securing it like this was way better than what I was doing before, so that's a good learning. There are still some gaps on here, which isn't great, but it's the first time I'm doing this, so I've decided I'm not going to overthink it too much or worry about that too much. I can take that learning to the next project.
Okay, so the base is in a good place for now, and the next step is going to be cutting some pieces to make the sides of the tray, which means using my trusty mangled bench hook. Now, there are probably better ways to do this, but this technique has been working pretty well for me, at least on smaller cuts like this, and it's essentially to fit the rip guide to the saw, make a cut on one side, and then flip the piece over and cut from the other side. I probably should have taken multiple passes on this, but the saw got through it without too much trouble. It was just slightly too thick for the saw to reach all the way through though, but the last little bit split pretty easily with a chisel. I think my dust collection could do with some work, but that's a problem for another time. Anyway, once I've cut all the pieces with the circular saw, it's just a matter of planing them smooth and square. When it came time to cut the slot in the sides for the base to slide into, I used tape and superglue again, as the pieces weren't big enough to be held securely in the vise. I'm using another new tool here, which is a record number 44 plough plane, which were manufactured between 1934 and 1970. So I guess it's not actually that new, but it's new to me, and it's one of the first times I'm using it. Much like the scraper, my technique needs a bit of work, but I'll learn a little more with each project I do. Now, I could have used a bunch of other techniques to make these grooves, like a router or a few cuts with a circular saw, but there isn't really a wrong or right way to do this, and I wanted to give this plane a try. Once all the grooves were cut, I could move on to cutting the sides to size, and I'm going to join these using miters, as I think it'll give the whole piece a clean and elegant look. Again, there are a number of ways to cut these miters, and I could have used jigs or power tools, but I opted for a challenge this time and a chance to practice my hand sawing. Before I glue these pieces together, I want to add a design element that will give the tray a more refined look and make it feel less basic. I'm going to chamfer the inside edges on all 4 sides, and I'll be doing this with a hand plane. Now, there are definitely more precise methods to achieve this, but using a plane is fun and it's pretty effective. And sometimes just having fun with the process is more important than the precision. Plus, it's pretty straightforward. I just secure the piece in the vise, hold the plane at an angle, and work my way down to the lines I've marked. Now that I've reached this stage, I can start to see how the whole piece is going to look, and I've made a conscious decision to leave out an earlier design element I was originally going to include, which is this point where all the triangles meet. I just thought it looked a little too rough, and I think I can still get a cool effect by using this portion of the base. So I cut that piece out, gave it a sand, and there were still some gaps. But I don't think they look quite as bad as they're more spread out, and I think I can fix these with a mix of sawdust and glue. The colour didn't quite match, but I actually think the darker tone worked quite nicely to accentuate the angles. Or maybe I'm just trying to convince myself it looks better than it does. I'll let you be the judge. The last thing I need to do before gluing it all together is fine-tuning the size of the base so that it fits in the mitered sides. And a few satisfying strokes with the plane, and it fits perfectly. Throughout this project, you may have noticed a lot of changes in the lighting, my outfit, and the length of my hair, and that's because I currently film these videos in small doses over a number of weeks between work and all of the other things involved in life. But hopefully it doesn't impact the overall video too much. Once the tray was out of the clamps, there were just a few areas to clean up and finesse, which I started doing with a bit of sandpaper, but quickly switched to using the plane and chisels as they left a much better finish. For a seemingly simple end product, there was actually quite a lot of complexity in this build, and I certainly learned a lot from the mistakes I made throughout. I think aside from the obvious lessons, I've learned to accept the fact that mistakes will always happen, and I should welcome them when they do, as they're important opportunities to learn. Considering I went into this project without much of a plan, I'm actually really pleased and slightly relieved that it actually works as intended. Anyway, if you've enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing, and let me know what you thought of the dice tray in the comments, along with what board games you'd use it for. Till next time, thanks for watching.